Welcome back to another episode of Practice Underwater. And if you're listening, well, then this is a little bit unconventional. So Nesto, our guest here, I'm with Nesto today. So if you're listening to this, then the most recent episode was part one of Practice Underwater, and that one was a little unique in that it was a solo episode. So it was just me, and I spent 35 to 40 minutes going through Nesto's story. Nesto has an untraditional story where he bought two practices with a partner, and then the partner ended up leaving, and Nesto had the two offices. They're very different in profile. One is much busier than the other. And so we kind of walked through that. And, if you're listening to this episode, then, if you haven't yet listened to the one last week, I'd recommend going last week. It was just me. And then now I'm here with Nesto. It's a little bit interesting though, because Nesto and I recorded, we did parts one and part two, and then they didn't record, so we had a technical malfunction. Then we did part one again, and then we also had another technical malfunction. And so I just said, you know what, Nesto, let me just solo record part one, just knock that out so we don't have to keep telling everyone your story kind of over and over again. And then we'll come back for part two. So we've already had a part two, and we talked through some things, and then now we're back to have the recorded part two that everyone else is going to listen to, where you can finally get to meet Nesto. So Nesto, welcome, I guess, back to the Practice Underwater, and welcome to the first time on the airwaves of the Shared Practices podcast. So how's it going, Nesto?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back, as you said, George. Hopefully, third time's a charm. And obviously, it's a pleasure and an honor to, be able to do this and, to kind of share my story and, kind of just have whatever insight people can pull from it, for on their own experiences might turn out valuable, I guess.
Yeah, and Nesto, one thing that it's a shame that the audience didn't get to hear what we had recorded, because I think that for you, I really appreciated, and I talked about this in my recording, but I really appreciated your mindset. And so, I've kind of talked through your situation. Our audience is aware of, all the details. I went through it at length and in detail. And so I guess, maybe just talk us through your mindset, in your situation. I know that when we first recorded, we talked about how this was a grittier practice underwater, and we've had several of those before. But I just think that in a tough situation, your mindset has been really admirable. So maybe just talk to our audience about what it's been like in the situation for you, how you've maintained belief, and just maybe kind of let them get a window into how you view the situation and how you keep yourself going each and every day.
Sure. I mean, the the way I always verbalized it was that, had I had a choice, this would have not been the route towards ownership that I envisioned. I've been a long time share practices listener, you know, right out of dental school, and you know, basically ending up with two practices, firstly with a partner, and then having that partnership kind of fall by the wayside just due to our personality and clinical differences. It was I was basically stuck in a situation where it was, well, okay, I have to kind of decide what my vision for these offices were and what my vision for my career was myself. I had very much, two sets of patient pools and two sets of staff that I cared a lot about, and I didn't want to, fail them or let them down by, choosing to kind of end the show early, so to speak. And it was one of those, well, at the same time, I have to then make very conscious decisions on how to get myself into a position where I can be profitable and I don't have to be as stressed because I ended up with twice the workload that I initially intended. So over the last, I would say, year and a half or so, all a lot of the stress that came with running a practice was not only twofold. It was also the fact that you have all this other clinical responsibility on top of it, and kind of learning uh, the process of ownership and having to do it twice with two offices that perform and grow very differently from each other. And so my mindset was, well, if I'm making the conscious decision to do this, and I am a shared practices coaching client, and one of my first calls with Suzanne was, she was like, was is this even what you want to do? and and if it's not, then then we should definitely figure that out first. And I was like, yes, this is what I want. I want to make these offices work, and so that's where the journey has been.
That's awesome. And I wanted to just kind of for our audience, the thing that we left part one with was I talked about how we really need to stop the bleeding at the second office and do what we can to minimize the cash losses there, so that we can at least start getting some more available cash flow for you to invest in marketing to grow the patient bases and to ultimately have an income for yourself as well. And so that was a big focus for me in the first part too. And when we recorded that, I kind of started with this observation that your associate at the second practice was not hitting their minimum, and actually the associate costs were almost the same in terms of like how much money was being paid out to the associate, was almost identical or very close to the amount of money that the office was losing every year or in the past year in 2024. And so I had suggested, potentially just having the associate spend their full time at the busier practice and then have you keep your, maybe 2 days at each office. And that would do a lot to reduce the associate costs at the slower office. And so that was how I started part two in our first recording. And then we kind of negotiated back and forth a little bit. And you kind of pushed back on that idea, gave me your resistance, which was valid resistance, mainly around just the way that the staffing works and the schedule and how that's not really feasible. And so then we talked about, okay, well, then maybe we'll reduce the associate schedule to 3 days a week at or 3 days a week at the busier practice and 1 day a week at the slower office. And then that was kind of where we left the part two that we had initially recorded. And I think the thought process there was the case acceptance that your associate has historically is not quite on the level of yours. So having you be the sole provider in that second practice, or the primary provider, would reduce the bleed because of the fact that you are more efficient per patient. And also heading into that first office, we want to expand capacity at that first office, the busier one, to keep it growing. And so that was kind of where we ended. And I think it's interesting because, you and I checked in a little bit, and I did make a comment when we recorded as well, which is if you just look at the first quarter of this past year, so the beginning of 2025, that slower office that's been historically losing money is actually like break even. And that's a pretty big deal. And so I was kind of giving this advice based on historical information, and I was sort of saying, when you pushed back on me on the cutting down the office to 2 days, I kind of agreed with you, and I was like, you know what, like it's actually showing some signs of life. And so so that was like the initial kind of when I ended part one, and I said, like, I have some observations. My observation was around, can we do something to the doctor days at each office to essentially turn what is a cash loss in that second practice into a break even, which I thought would be a very big step. And I think there's always a big step when you go from losing money to breaking even. That's a big step, makes things a lot more sustainable and allows you to be a lot more patient. And so in our update that we had before we recorded, you kind of alluded to some things there. So maybe, that was the part two that we had recorded last time. So just kind of take the audience from the journey from we had that episode, we discussed those things, and then you talked to your OM. You also kind of have seen some recent momentum. So maybe update us on what is currently going on between the two offices.
So we'll start with the busier practice. After our prior conversations, I had gone to my OM, who and who is also happens to be my hygienist at the busy office, and we discussed together about our situation with the associates, and with potentially adding on a fifth clinical day at that practice. And the current bottleneck is that we don't even have enough staffing for the 4 clinical days. We essentially have one front desk, 1.5 assistants, and 2 hygienists. So none of which are willing to work a fifth day. so to speak. None of the existing staff want to work that Friday. So it would have to be staffed aside from the associate with additional team members, and we are in the process of wanting to hire an additional team member, maybe two even, uh, just to kind of fill in that second front desk role, as well as a second part-time hygienist, part-time assistant, excuse me, so that we can kind of fully flesh out our the four doctor days that we currently have. And if we were to go that route, we can potentially try to find hires that are willing to pick up a Friday, which would open the opportunity for either myself or my associate to start working those Fridays. But that would be something that's a ways down the road potentially still. And then at the slower office, well, at least in 2025, we have started noticing that the phones are ringing more, and that patients are coming in and treatment acceptance is going up. I want to, credit some of that to the marketing agency that we're using, as well as, me and Caitlin, we've been trying to actively work on improving our front desk communication, patient verbiage, converting those phone calls into patient visits, and as well as treatment acceptance, not only for myself but for my associate as well. Um, I have kind of also sat down with the associate, kind of going over how she has felt her career has progressed in the last half a year or close to a year or so now that she's been here. And one of the things that we're constantly working on is not only mentoring in regards to the clinical skills and the procedure mix, things like that, but also just her improved confidence in terms of treatment planning comprehensively, in terms of getting patients to say yes to treatment that she feels like she can deliver well, and not necessarily have to refer everything either to myself or to an outside practice. And between a mixture of the systems that we're slowly improving within the office and my staff, and her clinical confidence improving, I think that the office is now showing a little bit more signs of life. And it's thankful, it's good that it's given me a little bit of a breather, because like you said, it is a big difference in terms of how it feels to go from a loss to break even, because my busier office has been profitable. So if I could break even at my slower one, well, then I'm technically profitable. And, so that has alleviated a little bit of stress, but it also, I'm very conscious that it really, every opportunity still matters when it comes to continuing this improvement, continuing this trajectory in the right direction.
So, this was all excellent. And that was the update that I got before we recorded as well. So, now our audience and we're all on the same page. And I want to just take a minute and talk about, kind of the general plan. So now that, what is very different than maybe we had discussed in part one, I think we feel confident that we're, we have enough momentum to make us think that we're like, for at least the next few months, let's assume that we're at break even at the slower office. And and so you've talked to your associate about the days, and so just kind of maybe fill us in on that conversation, just so that we can kind of all get on the same page there.
So we we discussed, right now she works 2 days at our busy office, 2 days at our slower one, and I basically flip flop with her, and we do like a an alternating stagger schedule. So so that way we technically have 4 days of the week that at each office that we're available to our patients that want to see us. If we were to change and reduce her days in our slower office, the end result would be that we would have to have fixed days where each of us would be in, which can potentially limit our availability to see certain patients of ours, not only for her but for myself. And she was open to the idea of adding on Fridays at the busier practice, but it would have to be done in such a way that she would not be limited to kind of pursue other opportunities and stuff like that as well. I did not want to kind of put her in a situation where the number of days per week that she would have to make available to me, and especially if I cannot guarantee her, time at the office, limit her from opportunities elsewhere to associate.
Yep, and that makes perfect sense. And so, the plan as we see it is to keep the doctor days the same and to focus on the other stuff. And so maybe just talk to us about there's a few things that you talked to me about. I think one, there's a big point is that, your monthly review with her regarding her performance. So maybe you can fill our audience in on, that conversation that you had with your associate.
So I've made it very clear to her when we hired her that, I wanted to make myself available, in whatever capacity I can give. Sometimes I still feel like I'm not in a position where I should be mentoring anybody, but apparently I've learned enough over the years, since I've graduated, that there's some knowledge to be spread. So, we've always had very good communication, even though we don't work at the same office together, to discuss and collaborate on cases and, and things like that. But at the same time, we always also try to make time to kind of go over, things that, she wants to learn, things that she's having difficulty with beyond the beyond the actual clinical work. So this comes in the form of, how do we talk to patients? How do we form our mindset around, not being so shy to recommend patients to sign on for, thousands and thousands of dollars of treatment. We don't always have to offer or bottleneck ourselves into offering the lowest cost solution because we don't think that the patients can afford it and stuff like that. So, having her build the confidence to recommend things to patients that she feels like would be best for them, and obviously continue to provide alternatives and things like that, has allowed her to, communicate to patients better and also increase the treatment acceptance. We've also had lengthy discussions on, how to basically, how to basically like make sure that when we communicate with our patients, we do so in a way that it doesn't scare them off and it doesn't overwhelm them at the same time, and and then I think that the a lot of that comes from being able to be confident about what you're able to provide, and and she has worked and improved a lot in terms of improving her clinical skill set, which gives her more confidence to go out and recommend these things to patients, whereas prior, she wasn't as comfortable even treatment planning that stuff because she knew that it was going to ultimately end up with a referral, either to an outside practice or to myself, because she wasn't comfortable delivering it. And and then as she's got the clinical repetitions down, I'm seeing now when I review the schedule, she is much more adept at telling a patient, well, this is what we can do for you today. And she'll go and execute to the best of her ability, and we handle it from there. And I think when patients can see that confidence from her, they're more on board with whatever she has to recommend to them.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so, then it seems like, I have your so then talk to me about just kind of like, so you said you're working with a coach, right? You're working with Caitlin, and so maybe talk to me about the like we recorded the first podcast, you went back to her, and you guys talked about that, and then now I have a plan here where you're really focusing on hiring select positions at each location, which we'll go over in depth with our audience, as well as improving your scheduling rate, phone communication, as well as case acceptance, with retention. So those are like kind of your four areas of focus that I have on my records from your call. So maybe just talk to me about I actually am very proud of the fact that we had a conversation and we had one set of recommendations, and then you go back, talk to your coach, and then you guys kind of come to the correct conclusion that keep things the way they are with the doctor days, and then have this kind of 4-point plan. So maybe just kind of talk to me about what that conversation was like, and where the change in plan kind of came from.
So, so at our busy office, we've consistently had a staffing issue. We for the I guess the past year and a half or so, was working with just one front desk and essentially two assistants. But one of the assistants has had to continue to cutting down her hours due to health reasons and personal reasons. And so we basically have, 1.5 assistants for the work week. And you couple that with the fact that our one and only front desk does not work our full work week either, especially like our Wednesday mornings, we do not have anyone at the front desk, and we have one assistant that has to both assist me and cover the phones in the front. So that becomes difficult, and we end up missing phone calls potentially because of that. My hygienist, one of my hygienists, does come in earlier, even before she sees patients, to help cover the phones, but that's also not a good long-term solution either. So we've been trying to, or at least we have plans to basically hire a float, or you know either part-time or full-time, to kind of cover the gap in coverage between the front office and the back office there. So that's what we have going on at the busier one. At the slower one, at least we're starting to notice that as the active patient count in the office increases. Right now, we are working there at one hygiene day a week, and both myself and my associate do hygiene at that office. But that over the last, I would say, year or so, has increased to close to 1.5 days of hygiene now. The hygienist that we have there, she added on a second day, and she stays for almost a full day. She leaves a little bit earlier because of her daughter. Um, so I, working with Caitlin, have been talking about, well, that office might start growing to the capacity where we can afford to find a hygienist who might be willing to work just one day a week, and that would give us essentially a third hygiene day at the slower office. And if the office continues to get busier, then we can basically have her add a second day as the patient base grows.
Yeah, so just to kind of recap, that was the first kind of focus, was hiring in some shortages, right? We talked about the busier office with that assistant and the floater, assistant slash floater, and then at the slower practice, I think that second hygienist who would start adding the third day and then eventually get to the fourth day, that would go a long way to have then one full time hygienist with one full time doctor at that office. So yeah, I think, and maybe can you just touch on, I believe Caitlin did the analysis of taking a look at like your bookings and how many openings you have, and all. That's something that's pretty routine for us when we recommend expanding a hygiene day. So, can you just talk through, what she saw going through the slower practice and the schedule?
So I don't think that I can go over it with as much accuracy as anybody from shared practices can. But essentially, we looked at the number of active patients at the practice, and given the number, however, whatever average hygiene visits that comes out to, um, you know, helps us kind of justify, well, okay, you technically have about, two hygiene days worth of patients, and then the fact that we have essentially 1.5 hygiene days of coverage currently. If we add just one day a week, then we're like a little bit over what we need, but then we can kind of hopefully be growing into it. And even if the schedule starts off a little bit light, um, not so much for my associate, but for myself, I can definitely say that many of the days that I'm there, I am blocked out of being able to do production because I have hygiene patients on my schedule, because there was no hygienist in that day. So even if I can get one additional hygienist in one day a week, and have 3 out of the 4 days covered, that would give either myself or my associate a little bit more time in the doctor's schedule to squeeze in potential emergencies and consultations.
Yeah, definitely. And I would recommend that be on the day that you're there, so that you could get those cleanings off your schedule. But then talk to me about what you guys discussed regarding improving your retention, because I'd imagine that a hygienist seeing patients for their cleanings is going to be more adept at reappointing and getting them back on the schedule compared to on the doctor side. So maybe can you just touch on kind of the work needed on the retention side?
So I know that with both my practices, we average about 80 to 85% hygiene retention, which is, according to shared practice philosophy, a little on the lower end. And it is something that we're, actively trying to work on. I was always under the impression that it was worse on the doctor side compared to hygiene because, like you said, the hygienists generally have a little bit more experience and a little bit more adept at making sure that the patients are reappointed. And I've always felt that it was either myself or my associate where the emergencies that we see or the patients that we see on the doctor side, sometimes we don't really have good systems in place to make sure that they're reappointed for hygiene. But then Caitlin did look at specifically my numbers and patient charts, and it was that overall average that happens to be low is actually from hygiene. So
Wow.
it's so it is now more telltale that we do have to work with our hygienists to really make sure that we're really reappointing close to 100%, if not 90 plus.
I love that because it's one of those things that, like, right, I just made the assumption it was on the doctor side. And the fact that, Caitlin went in there, looked at the data, saw that it was different. So what's the plan then? What are you going to be doing to improve your hygienist reappointment rate?
So I think part of it is, and I actually did have one of the meetings with my OM about it already, because she is, like I said, also my hygienist and my busier practice, is just making sure that every patient, make sure that we're constantly looking at those numbers. Um, the the hygienists do not look at our analytics software. So one of the things that Caitlin suggested might be helpful is either we put it up on the practice manager software's dashboard so that the hygienist can actively see it, because if they can see that their number is low, they're going to be more keen on improving it, or make sure that it's something that we bring up in our huddles to tell them, like, hey, like for last month you guys reappointed about 80%, you guys reappointed about 82%. We really should be shooting for 90 plus percent, and that way um, the hygienists know actually that they're not hitting what their goal should be, because at least as of right now, they don't I don't go over it with them really, and they don't really check on their own, so they don't know if they're doing well or not in that department. And I think just having them acknowledge that we're not reappointing as many as we should, hopefully will be enough to get some improvement there.
Yeah, that's excellent. And what I used to do back when I had, when I was GP office, was I used to write each hygienist's reappointment rate on Fridays on a little sticky note, and then I would put it on their desk so that when they came in Monday morning, they would see their reappointment rate from the prior week on a little sticky note. And that was just my way of doing it, right? But there's 100 different ways of doing that.
Right.
But I think that, again, what you said, that goes back to that principle of what's measured improves and what's measured and reported improves exponentially. And I think that just getting that feedback loop in place for your hygienists to be aware of their rate will help it improve and get into our benchmark of 90% or higher. So we've talked about the hiring, we've talked about the reinforced retention. Now I kind of want to go to, you had talked about Caitlin doing some training with your teams on phones. So maybe talk to me about, that I guess the training, why you feel that's needed, and what you hope it accomplishes.
So I think part of the uh, the things that I wanted to focus on was just making sure that the phones get picked up. We historically had about a 55% answer rate. That was tracked with Mango. You know, between the two offices, and that to me was definitely on the lower end. So it definitely helped that we added on a service like Golden Goose to basically help kind of capture some of those missed new patient phone calls. We, we also try to make sure that I have my staff provide phone coverage even if they're clocking in from home, as long as they can demonstrate that they're doing work-related stuff, so that we, especially in my slower practice where we are only open about 25 and a half hours a week, that we have more than 25 and a half hours of phone coverage throughout that week. So things like that will basically help make sure that the phones get answered. But then the second part of the equation was, well, even when they do answer the phones, are we effective at communicating to them, what we offer? The fact that we're primarily fee for service at our busier practice, and the fact that we're, a I would say 60-40 split between out of network and in the network. At our slower office, um, we have to kind of make sure that we are still effective at, telling these patients who we don't necessarily partake with, that they can still be seen at our office effectively. And and it comes down to actually reviewing phone calls. It comes down to kind of providing feedback, because I know for a fact that my front desk at my slower office, she is beyond friendly. She has all the patience in the world with patients, and she's just a very all-around positive person. But I think that there can be improvements where it comes to verbiage, where it comes to being able to convey the value that we provide, even though we are out of network with their insurance company, that they should come in, that I think she can definitely improve on when it comes to those phone conversions.
Yeah, excellent. So I guess that kind of brings us to the last item, which is improving treatment acceptance. So kind of walk through what is your plan to improve your treatment acceptance, and what what maybe gave you the idea that that was necessary. Just kind of walk through. Let's just kind of talk about your mindset around that improvement.
So that was again another one of those metrics that we look at and we track on a monthly basis of the dollars that we present versus the dollars that were accepted. And I think we wanted to work a little bit on simplifying that presentation, because we don't really have a proper treatment coordinator at our slower practice. It's either done by the doctor or by the front desk, up front. And so we wanted to kind of make sure that we have systems in place to make it simple to present to patients so they don't get overwhelmed by it, and also just make sure that we have proper protocols in place of, what are we comfortable, having patients split payments for, what do we absolutely need collected up front, and also, what we offer in terms of third-party financing, and have this be laid out in very simple terms for patients. And that should hopefully, translate to better case acceptance. The second part of it is on the doctor side, between myself and my associate, how we present treatment to patients, how we kind of handle those consultations, handle those conversations, so that we're effective at communicating the urgency, communicating the need, and the benefits of getting the work done, as opposed to pushing it off or letting it go by the wayside.
Great. Yeah, I think nothing I have to add there. And so just kind of maybe the one thing I want you to talk about is you're transitioning practice management softwares. So that's something that again is a consideration from your coach. And so when you think of the transition of a practice management software, the impact that has on your team, maybe talk to our audience about why you're doing that, and how that's impacting your treatment plan, so to speak, in terms of how to improve your offices.
So I can definitely talk about that. Are there any restrictions on mentioning like companies and brands and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think you should say I was using one before, and what I didn't like about it was this, and now I'm using a different one, but not mention the specific names of the companies.
Okay. So yeah, so we are currently using a cloud-based software, which is good. We like the ease of access. The reason why the a cloud-based solution was good for me is because my staff at both locations technically do cover and help book for the other location. And having a server-based system, I've worked with it with my IT company. It can definitely still be set up to do so, but there's more work logistically involved, and it just didn't make sense to me that as good as the server-based solutions are, I think the cloud for us right now just works better. But the gripes with it was more so on the side of the front desk. The software that we're currently using is very difficult to send claims, track claims, and also kind of just even just managing patient invoices. We have had to add a lot of third-party subscriptions to it to kind of cover the things that we want, such as patient reviews, such as patient consent forms, um, appointment reminders. So these are all things that we subscribe, with yet another service for on top of our practice management software. And when this newer company came around, we demoed it, and the main thing that we like was the fact that it had many of these solutions under one engine, and it still worked the way that I wanted it to work. The clinical side, you know, hygienists and doctors, assistants, most of these softwares are fairly the same. So, we really wanted to get the feedback from our front desk and from our treatment coordinator and from my OM, the people that really handled the billing and stuff like that, um, if they felt like the newer software will make their job easier. And, being able to do insurance verification, certainly was a very important thing that the first one really was not able to do well either. Having real-time insurance verification, even though it's not as who knows how accurate it's ultimately going to be, but we just felt like it was going to make it so that they didn't have to spend as much of the work hours doing the administrative stuff and having things kind of bundled in one place and not having to tab between 5, 6 different websites to check for credit card payments, to check for insurance, to check for whether consent forms were done, to check for if patients were if the appointment reminder was sent out. It was everything was done on a separate web page, and it's that was what really got cumbersome. And so we're hoping to basically reduce the number of hours that the staff have to spend on a per day basis to do that stuff so that they can focus on important and more important stuff like calling overdue recare, and calling people who didn't schedule treatment to come in and and get the work done, and also even just setting up payment requests virtually, and get make it easier for patients to pay because they appreciate the convenience as well.
Yeah, Nesto, that's excellent. And so, kind of moving forward then for you, we've gone through a lot. You have a lot on your plate coming up. So I guess, what's your reevaluation period? Like anytime I do something, I try to improve the business in some way, I work on something, and then I ask myself, at what point am I going to be done with these things, and I'm going to reevaluate how they go and maybe set a new list of priorities on things to work on.
So I told myself that again, I wanted to use 2025 as the year that I was really going to see how this slower office was going. And I mean, now it's already May, and at the time of this recording, and so Q2 is going to be coming up to an end soon. So I would say probably end of Q3. you know at that point, we'll have transitioned to the new management software. We'll have, had a couple of months of experience with that already, and the associate would hit her 1 year anniversary mark with us, and so I think by then, it will give me a good prediction as to what the rest of 2025 will go, and hopefully can paint a picture on, kind of what's up ahead. So I'm telling myself I'll probably give myself 3 to 4 months ish to kind of see how that kind of all plays out.
And we've talked about your vision before, where you've remained committed to both offices and having both offices long term. And so maybe talk to me about what do you see the role as these next 3 to 4 months in that longer vision that you have of having two offices that are performing well, where you can bounce between them. What role do you think the next few months play in the development of that vision long term?
So it's that's it's one of those things where I constantly do value the opinion of people who are on the outside, and people because they will offer a opposing perspective. For example, with my CPA, they definitely like the idea of me downsizing into a single practice more. And that's because I mean that's the way that they view it. They view it in terms of the numbers. But let's assume that I say that, well, okay, even if I have two profitable offices, if they're still going to tell me that I'm better off with one, well, I have the freedom to say I don't want to do it that way, and my vision for what I want to do with these offices, because they are both growing, and I want to be able to get them to the point where they actually outgrow the space that they're in. I want to be able to expand the number of operatories that are at each of these offices, perhaps either expanding into a different, like into an adjacent space that we have available, or moving into a different building altogether. But if I can get them both built up into multi-provider, group practices, that would be a great long-term vision. But I don't even think that if I had the remainder of the year, I would be able to tell whether that's on the horizon or not. I think that my goal with the next couple of months is really just to kind of tell me, you know, can I have two offices that are more or less self-sustaining in terms of not needing the other one to survive, whether it be financially or logistically, even with staffing. I have like my office manager who technically manages my busier practice, also happens to do a lot of the work and managerial administrative duties for my slower one. So if I can have them staffed to the point where they're running independently, separate from each other, with the added benefit if I need the coverage across the board, to still have that available, that would probably be an ideal for me.
So I think that's great. And one thing, you talk about this vision of two group practices, and I think for somebody listening, if you're talking about, one practice is going from 2 hygiene days to 3 hygiene days. You think of the road to a group practice, that's a long road. And what are your thoughts on the fact that you're on a path that potentially is a longer path to get to where you want to go? Like, how do you feel about the fact that your journey may be longer?
So it's one of those where it's, if I had to do it differently, like I said, I probably would have done it differently. But I know that there was a recent episode that released is where if you had gone and buy the wrong practice, you know, will it still turn out okay? Yes, but the journey might take longer, and that's kind of, probably where I'm at. So I don't doubt the fact that, the potential to grow these into larger offices are there, but whether or not that's feasible, whether or not that's doable, or even just how long that would take, it might take a little longer, But I'm also resolute with the fact that even if that wasn't the case, if I can just have, you know, the four ops at each office and just have the office be productive, like, would that be enough to sustain the quality of life and the lifestyle that I want, and the fulfillment from the profession that I, am looking for? I would still say the answer is very much yes. But I wouldn't want to limit myself to the potential of being able to take those, four op practices into something bigger if the opportunity presents itself, like however long that might end up taking.
Yeah. So that's awesome, and I think I've kind of let you talk a lot because last part one was a solo episode of just me. So I figured, our audience, just I want them to hear from you as much as possible because I think you have a really great mindset, and so I've asked you a lot of questions so that our audience can just hear the way that you're thinking through a gritty situation. I think it's excellent. And I think that in some ways you have to almost create like a little bubble for yourself where you're just kind of within your little bubble and you're just focusing on improving your business and just working on the little things like we had talked about, throughout this whole episode. You have your kind of your four things that you're working on for the next 3 or 4 months, and then you're going to get a new set of things, and you just kind of keep going through that journey. And I'm going to tell a story where for me, I was, this reminds me a lot of 2019 in my career, which is, 6 years ago now. I was I was in a similar spot where I bought a practice and then I overexpanded the team to the point where I wasn't profitable. And it was really challenging to just keep showing up and to keep showing up, giving it my best without the score of the game showing me that I was doing a good job. And I think that, like you're at a very interesting point right now because you've been showing up for, a year where it's been cash loss at the second office, not fun. And now you're kind of turning a corner where it's break even at the second office. And that's a big momentum thing that hopefully gives you a lot of energy to keep going. But I think, the thing that I really felt was, for me, it was months of just showing up and showing up and showing up and just kind of keep getting myself to get up and keep at it. And then I remember there was this day that I walked in and I had two dentists and four hygienists. And there was times where the hygienist had a whole day with no patients, and it was a long road to get to a point where the practice was busy. But then I walked in one day, and it was like I can actually call the date on the calendar, and it was like the whole schedule was full. Both dentists were busy, and it was like kind of an effortless $10,000 day. And I just remember thinking like, wow, like all of that showing up and, just kept showing up. I walked in one day and it just surprised me that we got to somewhere materially different than where we were before. And I had just got used to showing up and not getting that result or that gratification of, the external factors showing me that the inputs were working. And I think that, that would be kind of the thing I'd really want to leave you with and to leave our audience with, is that, like, if you asked me, what do I think the future looks like for Nesto? Well, I'm just going to judge Nesto's process. And I think that Nesto, one thing I've just continually said over and over again is that the mindset and attitude that you have is spectacular. And so the way that you just continue to show up and you just focus on improving, and we just went through all of these things, you invest in your coaching relationship, you really work with your coach to improve your business, and just keep doing that over and over again and not losing that belief, which I think is one of the most admirable things from you through these two parts, is that you haven't lost your belief and you continue to believe that these are going to be multi-doctor practices. And I think, keeping that belief at the center of what you're doing and continuing to show up, um, I just know it's a matter of time. It's a matter of when, not if, so long as you keep investing in that process of improving. And so, I think that that's, for me, kind of what I'd want to leave the whole episode with, is, that every time I pushed you in all of the different times we've recorded this, I've pushed you and your CPA's pushing you, sell one office. You're saying no. I'm like, okay, like, do this. You're like, no, this is my dream. This is what I want. And I think that having that level of commitment to what you're doing, um, it shows that drive that you have to make it work your way is what keeps you showing up. So for me, I think that is what I would really want our audience to take away, because in these grittier practice underwaters, I think it's just, there's such a valuable thing to take away from the fact that, regardless of the situation, your attitude and your work ethic and your belief are things that are yours and no one can take them away from you. And, like, I think that you've just really modeled that extremely well. So I think that's what I really hope our audience takes away from hearing you today, and maybe hearing my first part where I kind of summarized, your entire situation. So I guess, Nesto, those were my kind of long-winded thoughts. Any thoughts that come up as you kind of hear me say that?
I mean, yeah, and you hit it on the head, and and yes, you have shared part of your story of what you went through in the past as well, with your audience. And I remember talking to one of my friends who also happens to be a single owner of two practices, one of which was profitable and the other one which was not so much. And we joked about the fact that it's like, well, do we just kind of like hide in the corner and cry, or do we like figure out how to do something about it? So we obviously decide that, yeah, we're gonna do something about it, and we're not gonna, we tough it out because we see that there is potential down the road for something better. And so that obviously is a push. And but I would also say that, I mean, again, I very much respect and admire your kind words, but a lot of it is not because of me, it's the people that I have around me. I am very thankful that my staff, when they found out that the partnership was being dissolved, they were like, you know what, whatever we have to do, we got your back. And and they would put in hours, they would taking on duties that off the clock, just to make sure that it works and make sure that the offices stay running. And they were like, don't worry about it. Like, don't worry about, us disappearing on you because we're here, and the fact that I have staff that are willing to tell me that they're coming up to bat for me, through this process, obviously, gives me a drive to, push and do better. I take some admiration in the sense that with my busier practice, the fact that I was able to, kind of take it from, whatever it was collecting and almost doubling, after about a year or so, gives me some resolve that as long as the patient care is there, as long as, you know, like I'm able to go to sleep at night knowing that I provided the best care that I can for my patients, and then the reviews reflect that, and I'm treating them well. That you know the financial success should follow, and if I was able to kind of do that well with that busier practice, in some ways I'm like, well, why can I not do that with the one that's slower? Even though the journey obviously is going to be a much slower process. In one office we were able to turn a profit and double collections within a year, and the other one it's been 3 years and we're still trying to get it back to where it was when we bought it. So that's the duality of the two practices that I have, but also it's a proof of concept that if you can potentially stick it out and make the right decisions and have the right advisement around you to kind of steer you and keep you on track, that why should it not be doable? Because I kind of did it once already.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think that that's a great place to end. I think this part too, and I'm excited for you to keep going and keep going along your journey. And I think it would be great to, at some point when we've had a material change in the circumstances of the situation, have you back on for part three, and just keep the dialogue going. So thanks for coming on, Nesto, for a few times now. And I think I'm really happy our audience had a chance to hear you, because part one was great in that I got to inform our audience of our situation, but hearing you speak through it is just a whole different level. And so I just really appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you informing our audience on your next steps and what you're working on and why. And we look forward to seeing you back on another episode of the Shared Practices podcast.